Chateau Cascade by Dusty Ridgeman. For those who seek the chateau, for those the chateau seeks, be you prideful or humble, be you strong or meek, come sing upon our bridge, come pass o'er the falls. Your destiny awaits. Be welcome in our halls. Chapter 1. The Chateau. The river Sphinx had taken its name from a riddle-posing god. Some said that the spirit still lurked above, a danger to those who would dare the mountains from whence the river flowed. Running northerly, the Sphinx split the world in twain, separating east from west. Across its many miles was an immaculate stone bridge, which sat atop the waterfall, its many stalwart columns standing against the raging waters. Flowing through the gaps in the columns, the water spilled away into whatever unseen mysteries lay beneath the airborne continent. Built into this bridge was a chateau, a castle, a stronghold which had existed for ages and stood inexplicably strong and unmarred against the eroding waters for all of that time. Chateau Cascade. The name put shivers up the spines of sellswords and glory-seekers alike. It was a nation like no other, consisting only of a few farming communities and its single titular castle, and what a castle it was. This was a true wonder of the world, sitting at the centermost point of that massive bridge. Pointed spires grasped skyward, and below them, stained glass windows served to make the chateau look more like a cathedral than a stronghold. Lovers from all nations flocked to the chateau, believing that a wedding in its magnificent courtyard would be blessed with lasting strength. Above it all was beautiful, ageless Cecilia, glancing sidelong at her court as she sat askance on her throne of gems. It was often said that she had an iron in every fire and a scheme for every enemy, even the ones that she currently regarded as friends. Her true age was a hotly debated topic in the chateau. She had been the queen for as long as anyone could remember, but retained the body of a fragile, waif-thin youth. Her peculiar violet hair cascaded down her back like the waters of her castle's namesake. Only her fierce eyes betrayed her true age. Looking into those faded grays might give one a heavy feeling in the stomach, the uncomfortable weight of aeons. The people of the chateau accepted her rule gratefully. She had kept them from the dangers of the east and west alike, ruling with a just hand. She had brought them prosperity through her sponsorship of adventurers. Her leadership was unmarred by her sex. The fickle chaos of womanhood seemed to have all but vanished from her, perhaps stolen away by the many years that she had lived. In its place was a deep strangeness. Her words and behavior were often cryptic, and yet her leadership had kept the chateau safe for centuries or longer. The Cascadians accepted her, even without knowing her true nature, though salacious rumors abounded. Was she a vampire, bypassing her kind's weakness to the sun through some trick of magic? Or did she periodically bathe in the blood of 100 virgins as part of some obscene Goetic ritual to secure her perpetual youth for each coming century? If her advisors knew the secret of her youth, they weren't telling. I'm going to be a hero. Though Jack repeated the words in his head, their meaning felt far away from him as he tended bar at the Ale Crab Inn. It was late, and he was tired. There were no fanciful Cascadian knights to serve, nor any beautiful maidens. Instead, he was stuck with the usual drunks who called Good Harvest their home and lacked the good sense to stay in during the crimson cold of Crovel season. He stood there washing a cup, the same cup that he had been washing for the last 10 minutes. His boss had always told him to at least look busy. Sets the customers at ease, the fat man had said. Jack didn't know why he bothered. Perhaps it was a hero's duty to persevere even in the face of absolute boredom. Even so, the only customer at the moment was old Cross-Eye, passed out in the corner at his own table. He didn't know the man's real name. only that his eyes had become crossed long before this particular binge. He thought about grabbing the man and showing him the door. That was what he ought to do, what the fat proprietor would have wanted him to do. He pictured how it might go. Cross-Eye would struggle, burping and vomiting all the while. Then, perhaps, he might mutter out some drunken wisdom. "We've been here before." Jack decided to let the man be. Glancing out the window, he squinted into the ruddy light of the blood moon. The shores of the Sphinx were out there, teeming with a wealth of crabs and crawfish. Running a hand through his dirty blonde hair, Jack mused on the fact that Good Harvest probably wouldn't exist if not for that river. Travelers only came here to get a bite to eat, on their way west to the chateau, or east to the forbidding lands of the affiliation. Jack shuddered, thinking of the dead things that lay in wait there. Of all his father's outlandish tales of warning, those were the only ones that gave him pause. As far as he was concerned, the dead ought to stay in the ground. But there was always the chance that his father was just making it up. The old man also believed that Easterners had tentacles, after all. Jack set the glass down on the bar top. He had decided that upholding pretense was pointless if Cross-Eye wasn't going to mark him. He longed for a traveler to step through those doors, some heroic adventurer with a gleaming sword and a thirst for righteousness. "I need you, Jack Barnswallow," he might say, slamming his gauntleted fist onto one of the tables. "I don't care that you're only 16. We know that you've got what it takes. Come on, son." Jack sighed. Yeah, right. He might see travelers, sure. This was, after all, one of the only places that they could find rooms for rent without having to ask random farmers to spare space in a barn. They always had words like rustic or quaint or shithole to describe his humble little village. Though he had listened for it, he had never once heard it described as a good place to find the world's next up-and-coming hero. He turned around and leaned with his back against the bar. He no longer wanted to look at Cross-Eye's balding head as he snoozed away in the corner. Instead, he looked inward, thinking of how he had been rejected by the chateau a few months prior. "It's fine," he thought. "I can still do this. I just have to keep training. They'll take me next time." He knelt down and grabbed a couple of growlers from beneath the bar. They weren't very heavy, but at least it was something. He alternated, bringing each of them to his chest in curling motions, the amber liquid in them sloshing as he swung them around. It did not even occur to him that he might look silly if someone were to catch him doing it. The proprietor of the establishment would not be coming back at this hour. Jack had been working here since his rejection, and he had only seen the man in the mornings. As such, he was largely left to handle the responsibilities of the bar alone. He was fine with it. The job paid well enough, more than the fistful of nothing that his father was giving him for helping out at the farm. He supposed that if he earned enough money, he could at least afford to buy some basic military equipment. More than once, he had been tempted to take coins from the till, but he had not succumbed to those urges. The idea did not seem very heroic to him. He kept bringing the growlers to his chest, his mind drifting away again. He pictured the little pile of coins, growing slowly but surely in the drawer in his room back at the farm. What would he spend it on? He could not wait too long. It might take a lifetime of work to afford a real set of arms and armor. He pictured himself raising a shining bastard sword to the sky, rallying his men behind him. He deflected an orc's axe with his gleaming shield in one effortless, fluid motion. In his daydream, he wore a suit of heavy plates that didn't weigh him down at all. He dodged and maneuvered, parried and thrusted. Back at the bar, he grunted out a laugh. He would be lucky to afford some rusty chainmail and a dagger. It would be worth it, though. He smiled, redoubling his efforts with the growlers. Once he got himself a sword, even a cheap hand-me-down short sword, he could get used to its weight and feel. He could learn to sharpen and maintain it himself. And armor, he knew, was heavy. If he was to match the combat gymnastics in his daydream, he'd have to get something to practice in. Everything would be okay. He was working hard, and every step he took felt like he was going in the right direction. But even so, there was a niggling, nagging voice in the back of his mind that told him nothing that he did would be enough. What he really needed, the voice said, was talent, a power like the ones that the innates had. But one could not learn that sort of thing. Either you were born with it, or you were not. But what of magic? The voice asked. Magic, that supposedly evil force which his father had spent a lifetime warning him about. It had become a source of endless curiosity for him. With each of his father's admonitions, he had become more and more convinced that spellcraft was his path to heroism. But how? He knew that the Cascadians used magic. If only he could slip into their libraries. His face scrunched itself into a tight scowl. He had concluded that if he were a Cascadian knight, they would let him read whatever he wanted. And if he knew magic, they would let him become a Cascadian knight. Visions of chickens and eggs danced through his head, and he could not decide which had come first. He set the growlers down, turning back around and breathing heavily as he leaned against the bar. He glanced up at the round wooden clock above the bar. Midnight was coming. Jack watched the little hand, his eyes following its jerky, agonizingly slow movements. What would he do once his shift was over? His legs and arms still ached from the morning's farm chores, as well as his midday workout. Even so, he didn't feel like going to bed. He had a nervous energy to him, a sensation that time was running out. He supposed that it was. There was less than a year left until he'd be allowed to reapply at the chateau. Should he fail again, he'd have another year after that. They didn't waste their time with you after the third try. Jack furrowed his brow in the clock's direction. A loud banging noise jolted Jack out of his thoughts. He jumped, then turned around. A man in a greenish-brown cloak walked in. He was middle-aged and weasel-faced, with patchy dark hair sprouting unpleasantly in an ill-formed coffee-colored beard. The rest of his hair, such as it was, formed a horseshoe on his head. He sat down in front of Jack at the bar, threw a massive burlap sack onto the adjacent stool, and looked at him expectantly. Jack's mouth formed into a frown as he looked the man over. He shifted around on his stool, his head turning this way and that, as though he expected a lawman to come tap him on the shoulder at any moment. His brown, weasel eyes sat much too close to each other on his weathered weasel face. The hilt of a stiletto poked out from his waist. Jack took him for a brigand, and wondered at what ill-gotten treasures the stranger's giant, overstuffed bag might hold. "Boy, steelberry wine." His voice came out in a throaty rasp. What makes a man sound like that? Jack wondered. He pictured the cutthroat, making his way through the underbrush, carefully avoiding the main roads. How long had it been since he'd spoken to another man? Jack nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on the stranger. He turned and pulled down the bottle from the highest shelf. It was the only such bottle in the house. His voice cracked a little when he told the stranger the price, but the man waved his arm dismissively. As Jack poured the dark, silvery gray liquid into a cup, it occurred to him that he had never actually seen it outside of a bottle before. Its aroma was exotic, a curious mixture of cinnamon and lilac. The smell made Jack uneasy. "Got a name, stranger?" he blurted, almost immediately turning red in the face. The stranger cleared his throat grotesquely, loudly. He glared at Jack. "What's it to you?" he said. Jack's mouth opened, but before he could think of something to say, the man spoke again. "Name's Poe. Leave the bottle," he said, slapping a thick, unevenly milled golden coin on the table. "And bring meat." Emblazoned on the coin was an image of a bearded man, wielding some sort of long rod or staff in one hand, and a circular metal ring the size of a man's head in the other. Jack recognized it as the currency of the affiliation, the government, if one could call it that, to the east. If it had been a Cascadian coin, it would have had Lady Acelia's mysterious and jaded face stamped on it. A Western coin would have only had the rune of virtue on it. Jack's father had taught him that in the Imperium it was known that man is fallible. The only worthy icons were those made in homage of tradition, and moral law. It didn't matter. As far as the proprietor of the bar was concerned, coins were coins. Jack supposed that no one in his little backwater town would turn down gold, regardless of whose face was stamped on it. He took it and went off to the other end of the bar, trying his best to look busy and disinterested. The stranger clearly wanted to be left alone, and Jack was half sure he'd end up shanked if he tried his luck at a conversation. His eyes darted to the blackjack hidden underneath the bar. He shook the thought away. He told himself that, as much as he might look like a highwayman, this could just be an ordinary traveler. Still, his father's warnings echoed in his head. He had come from the East. Jack was sure of it. And in the East, there were demons and demon magic. A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, right. He turned from the blackjack and disappeared into the back kitchen. As he prepared the meal, he was still able to keep an eye on the stranger, stealing glances through the low stall doors. The man was ravenous. He poured the wine down his throat until the bottle was empty. When Jack finished frying up the goat steaks, Poe tore into them with gusto that only a road-weary man could muster. When he had finished, he washed the meat down with 2 more bottles of some local piss-water ale. "Bastard made me do it. Should have paid me what I was owed," he mumbled to himself. One of the bottles was still in his hand. "Do what?" Jack asked, trying to sound nonchalant. He had returned to cleaning his glass. Poe looked up, his weaselly face dropping as though he hadn't expected to be heard. "Nothing," he said. He laid down a silver coin with the same rod and ring symbol. "Give me a room." Jack retrieved a key from the drawer beneath the bar. "You're upstairs," he said. "Second room on the left." Taking the key, Poe stumbled up the stairs. He dragged his sack the whole way, paying no heed to the thudding sounds as it struck against each of the wooden steps. Jack sighed. Highwayman or not, the stranger hadn't caused trouble. As he put his glass away, he realized that he had actually been hoping for some kind of confrontation. A robbery, a scuffle, an argument even. Anything, really, to break up the monotony of his small-town life. He imagined the people the next morning cheering his name. He had heard that in the western lands, in the Imperium, they had papers where the day's news was printed. What would the papers say about him? "Local boy saves bar from would-be robber." He shook his head. Of course the news wouldn't reach that far. And even if he had rightfully smacked Poe with the blackjack, he doubted anybody in Good Harvest would care either. There wasn't a lot of room for heroics in a town whose main appeal was the tastiness of its crawfish. Glancing over to the corner, Jack saw that Cross-Eye had disappeared. Good, he thought. No messes to clean up tonight. He walked out among the tables and began wiping them down. It was then that he saw it, a ponderous tome, lying on the stool where Poe's bag had been sitting. First came hesitation. This was another man's property. What he should have done is taken the book and marched directly upstairs to hand it over to its rightful owner. But Jack knew his curiosity wouldn't let that happen. He'd have to open it and see what it was. Could it be a diary? A ledger accounting for each of Poe's depredations? Might it describe the many men that he had killed? What salacious details would he find inside? He could bring it to the local law, once he had read through it, of course, waving it over his head like a madman. The case cracked. The criminal apprehended. All thanks to Jack, local boy hero. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that he still had no real proof that the man was a criminal of any sort. "But he is," said the voice. "You know he is." It was the same voice that had been counseling him to seek magic as a solution to his problems at the chateau. "You have to take chances if you want your dreams to come true," the voice said. Jack stepped forward and took the book into his hands. It was leather-bound and thick. Turning it around, he saw the cover. On the Principles of Basic Elemental Magic. "I must be dreaming," Jack said aloud, his voice a breathy whisper. His eyes had gone wide. He supposed that it was not very heroic for him to take the book. And yet, when he left for the evening, it was tucked awkwardly into the waistband of his trousers. It traveled with him back to his father's ranch house, where it was spirited away into a secret nook of Jack's room. He probably stole it anyway, Jack thought. And besides, if I learn magic, I'll be able to do so much good in the world. The justifications rained through his mind like rocks in an avalanche, one after the other in an unending cascade. That night, he did not get any sleep, and in the morning his eyes ached from the strain of his long read. Throughout the day, and indeed throughout the next week, Jack worried that the man would come back for him. But even if the stranger had noticed his lost prize, he did not return to make trouble over it. Jack heard that he had left in the morning without so much as a slice of bacon for breakfast. He wondered if Poe had even known that the book had been in his possession. Such an item was priceless. Possession of it would be grounds for execution in the West and destruction of every last page. And Jack had heard that in the East, the Tower Lords guarded magical knowledge with a violent jealousy. Only here in Cascadia could one study on their own in relative safety, but the books to do so remained rare and well guarded. And now one was Jack's, and Jack's alone, to peruse at his leisure. As fear of the brigand passed, he found himself smiling, even as he played ranch hand for his father. He had finally punched his ticket to greatness and glory. Before that night, Jack had started to feel like he was floundering. His first rejection from the chateau had, in his most secret moments, made him question whether or not he would ever be able to become a hero. Every morning he would wake up with a heavy feeling in his stomach. In his half-awake, half-asleep state, he would imagine a metal bar floating above his bed. He would reach out as though to grab it and pull himself into the day, only to find nothing but air. Shaking the strange fantasy from his head, he'd force himself fully awake and plod through his daily tasks. Now, with the book in his possession, his confidence had reawakened. Each morning he'd find a looking glass and examine himself. A scrawny, tall boy stared back at him. And yet, he could also see the nascent results of the last few months of training. His efforts had created a base of muscle, the makings of a man attaching themselves strand by strand to his boyish frame. Most of all, he could see potential. I will become great, in body and mind both, he thought. Nothing can stop me now. The months flew by in a whirlwind of self-improvement. I'm going to be a hero. Jack repeated the words to himself over and over as he stared into the candle. Clenching his fists tightly, he leaned forward in the chair and started mumbling an incantation. He tried to ignore the aching, pounding feeling in his biceps and legs. That kind of training was over for the day, he reminded himself. Now was the time to attend to his real studies. These were the secret efforts that would make him into a hero worthy of a place in the chateau. He narrowed his eyes and focused, as though expecting the flickering light to reveal the world's secrets to him. Instead, the fire snuffed itself out. He sighed, leaning back in the chair. At least it felt good to relax his body. Magic, he decided, was a fickle thing. He'd say the words and he'd move his hands, gesturing just as the book had instructed. Sometimes he'd inscribe runes on a page or perform an odd little dance. He was thoroughly confused by the tome's instructions and didn't understand how any of this helped to fashion spellcraft. One day, Jack would arrive at a greater understanding. He would come to know that most wizards fumble in the dark, that even accomplished spellcasters were often incapable of describing how their powers actually worked. There might even come a time when he would learn of deeper magic, darker magic, of the ways Guitia, and of the ley that permeated the world. One day, he decided, he would tear back the veil and glimpse the greater mysteries. But for now, he remained with the fumblers. He wished that he did not have to whisper so. Could that be what was confounding his attempts? A lack of volume? Perhaps. But secrecy, he knew, was needed. This wasn't his first night exhausted by clandestine practice, and it certainly would not be the last. Bit by bit, he would learn this art, his father's protestations be damned. His mind wandered back to its usual obsession, Cascadia. He thought of the citizen mercenaries who had proved their worth, how they were given lodgings in the chateau itself. One day, he would be up there with them, he was sure of it. He pictured himself standing behind one of those stained glass windows, looking down the falls and off the edge of the world. No more milking goats for me, he thought. He wrinkled up his nose as he remembered their stench and that of the putrid milk that they produced. It was almost enough to rip him out of his reverie. Almost. His thoughts drifted. It wasn't really the accommodations that he was after, was it? What, then? Wealth? It was true that adventurers in the chateau's employ often made their fortunes on the road. Jack had seen them often enough, passing through his jerkwater town wearing armor that was as costly as a house. Money had been on his mind lately. If he had been born into affluence, all of this training would have been unnecessary. He could have simply bought his way in, handing over some vast endowment of gemstones or gold, and receiving his Cascadian citizenship just like that. A magic item would have been better, but those were far rarer than gems. It was said that you couldn't be born into citizenship, but the reality of the matter was that wealthy fathers paid their sons' ways. Idealistic as he was, Jack wasn't under any illusions about this. He thought of those sons as the lucky ones, and unlike the lucky ones, he'd have to earn his way in. Of course, even if he had the money, his own father would never pay for something like that. Cascadian citizenship was a luxury that he did not care to afford, even if he could. He owned a farm, and that was good enough for him. By the standards of those in the chateau, he was poor, but what of it? "This is a good life," he often said. "Be grateful. You don't want anything to do with those damned wizards anyway." A good life, Jack thought, leaning forward in his chair. He twiddled his fingers and stared at the dead candle wick, mentally willing it to come alight. No, he thought. A good life would be riding out on a horse and doing battle with some great evil, or traveling the Orloan desert, a dusty sirocco at his back as he rushed forward across the burning land. There was a sword in his hand, and a beautiful maiden crying out for him to save her from a sand spinner's deadly embrace. Now that was a good life. His father wouldn't know a good life if it bit him in the ass. Jack whispered a few more words from the book, waving his palm over the candle wick. No luck. What color hair, he wondered, would the maiden have? He pictured her first with a blonde bob in the style of the West, then a fiery mane, the sort often seen on those who had been touched by God and given the power of the innate, or so Jack had heard. Then, finally, hair that was dark and flowing, the kind that he had been told his mother had before her passing. He wondered what it would be like to be with a woman. Maybe that was it. Women. Was all of this just so he could know their soft touch? He had to admit, the thought was appealing. He could not help but notice that the women who stuck around in this rustic riverside town were never very attractive. It seemed that all the beautiful ladies were always whisked away by some Cascadian noble or wealthy traveler from afar. As the innocence of youth began to escape him, he often found himself cursing the seeming unfairness of this. But he wasn't about to wallow in it. No, he would train. He would train and become worthy of being named a Cascadian knight. Then everyone would see his worth. Perhaps that was it. The title. Cascadian Knight. To be a citizen was to have prestige, but to go further and join the knighthood was the highest mark of honor that a man could earn. Each of these citizen mercenaries was said to have the power of 100 or maybe 1,000 ordinary men. Jack had decided that it must be true, no matter how unbelievable it sounded. How else could this little country have survived, sandwiched so between the belligerent East and West? All that power, and with it, respect. He'd have the ability to save the whole world if he wanted to, and everyone would know it. Would his mother, then, looking down from the heavens, smile upon his good works? He hoped so. The spell he was working on was finished. All that was left was the command word. It slithered its way out of his lips, a low but forceful murmur. The candle came alight. For a few seconds, it burned far brighter than ought to have been possible from such a tiny wick, then settled into its usual cozy flicker. Jack looked around the room. It wasn't the first time that he had made this spell work, but he was still half expecting a ghost to slip through the walls and attack him. When nothing came, a broad smile passed over his face. "No demons here, Pa." He leaned back again, putting his hands behind his head. He remembered the argument with his father from earlier that day. Just another iteration on the same argument they always had. Jack would accuse his father of not caring about his son's dreams, and in return, he would receive recriminations in the form of questions. Why would you want to run off and join a pack of demon wizards? They'll use magic on you. Don't you know magic is dangerous? What's the point of applying again? They won't take you. You're no fighter. I raised you to live a better life than that. You can't even grow a beard yet. Do you really want to go get killed in a war? Never mind the fact that there was no war. And if there was, Jack would be the one fighting for peace. That's what the Cascadian Knights did, wasn't it? Jack was certain that Cascadian might was the only thing keeping the East and the West from each other's throats. He sighed. His father would never understand. But he was right about one thing. The chateau wouldn't take him unless he had some kind of talent. A man could buy his way into citizenship, but becoming a Cascadian Knight was only for those with merit. Be they skilled martially or magically, one had to be exceptional if they wanted to work for Lady Acelia. Jack supposed that he could become a rank-and-file soldier. Cascadia did have a small standing army of ordinary people. But where was the potential for heroism there? That sort of position didn't grant citizenship, only a regular wage and unending guard duty. He pictured himself standing in front of a gate with a sheathed sword at his side, rain pouring down on him. No, he decided, I'll not be a scarecrow. Smiling smugly, he redirected his attention toward the flame that he had created. He moved his hand forward, pinching the wick between his thumb and index finger. He felt the sizzling heat as it was snuffed out. Finding his way to his bed, he allowed himself to be claimed by slumber. It was a restless sleep, for dreams of the future nipped relentlessly at his heels. The next day was his 17th birthday. He rose with the sun and had the same series of tired arguments with his father. Then, after his chores were done, he took passage on a farmer's cart to the chateau. The old countryman was half deaf and nearing his declining years, so the journey was a silent one. Once he arrived at the chateau, he felt as though things were happening very quickly. First, there were the guards that looked at him like he was something the cat dragged in. Then there was the wormy bureaucrat, who asked him questions while looking down his long nose. And worst of all, there were his own answers, which felt embarrassing as he gave them. Later, with the benefit of hindsight, they would feel more embarrassing still. He was asked if he could fight. I've been practicing with a stick, he answered. A stick. The interviewer actually scoffed at this. Jack felt his face burning, his heart racing. He tried to explain that he was saving for a sword, and that he would do anything that it took to become a Cascadian Knight. Always his words seemed wrong. They were awkward, tilted sideways as they came out of his mouth. Why do you even want to be a citizen? The bureaucrat asked, cutting him off. The man's voice was filled with exasperation. From what I understand, you live well enough. Your father pays his taxes, and we protect him and everyone else in your village. You ought to be milking his cows, not strutting around over here pretending to be something you're not. Goats, sir, Jack corrected, eager to say something that couldn't be wrong. Goats? Well, if you say so. Look, I might have a position in the constabulary open for you, but that's the best I can do. Sir, I want to be a citizen. I'd make a good knight, I swear. I've been learning... Jack stopped there, afraid to say more. If he admitted to teaching himself magic, there would be questions. Perhaps there would even be accusations of theft. How else would a farm boy have gotten hold of a priceless magic tome? And would the risk really be worth it? What would he even be able to show this arrogant little man? Maybe he'd light a candle or chill a glass. Even those simple parlor tricks were unreliable. He remembered how he had once shattered a mug at the Ale Crab Inn. He had been forced to scurry into the back room with his ice-blue hand hidden in an apron. After that, he had resolved never to practice in public again. What if someone had seen? What if his father had found out? The old man's words echoed in his head. You get yourself wrapped up in magic, it'll drive you mad. That's what happens to all wizards. Madness. It was nothing more than superstition, Jack had decided. the idea that magic caused insanity. Or maybe it did, but only if you used it wrong, like accidentally cutting yourself with a knife. There was, however, a small part of him that feared. He had heard many stories of would-be wizards who met with unlikely accidents or turned to dark deeds shortly into their studies. Could all of those tales have been lies? And if they were true, could it really be mere coincidence? On the other hand, he had met spellcasters. He remembered a hot summer night when Cascadian soldiers had passed through Good Harvest on their way southwest. Their leader had carried a sword that glowed with the same golden light as the moon above, and as soon as Jack saw it, he knew that he was standing before a company of sorcerers. The men were returning to the castle from some mission in the east, and while many of them looked worse for the wear, none of them appeared to have lost their minds. He remembered shouting an endless barrage of questions from below their horses. None of them had bothered to acknowledge his existence, except to shake their heads at the impertinence of youth. "I'm older now," Jack thought. Wiser. "What have you been learning?" the interviewer asked, interrupting Jack's wandering thoughts. His voice was becoming even more impatient. Oh, no, Jack thought. He had let his mind get away from him again. He had to come up with an answer, and fast. Whatever he said next, revealing his magical training was off the table. His talents might have impressed some children at a birthday party, but he suspected that this man would be far more interested in something that would be useful on a battlefield. "I meant to say I've been exercising," Jack said, the pace of his words quickening. A sheen of anxious sweat appeared on his forehead. "Training my body," he continued. "Volunteering for more jobs on my pa's farm, extra chores and the like. It's hard work, running around on a farm. I don't get tired easily, not anymore. I even move rocks around the field when I've got nothing else to do. Big, heavy ones. And I've been doing a little extra work for my neighbors, clearing some land that's gone wild, and..." The words spilled out of him, with barely a pause in between. Why shouldn't the man be excited to hear his progress? Jack certainly was. It had seemed an obvious enough thing that he should start his self-improvement with his body, and he had been working at it since his first failure at 16. It did not occur to him that anyone could fail to find this impressive, or at least compelling. He was proud of the progress that he had made, though he knew that he still had a long ways to go. "You're still scrawny," was all the man said. His words were a needle in the balloon of Jack's confidence. Jack sucked in his breath and endeavored to keep himself aloft. Collecting himself, he made one final push. "But I've been drinking a lot of goat milk and eating goat cheese. I'm getting bigger. Stronger, I mean. I hate the taste, but it's helping me grow." That evening, Jack came home and sat, utterly dejected, next to his father's birchwood coffee table. His eyes had settled on a nearby window, though he did not hearken to the sun's fading light. Instead, his attention focused inward as he played and replayed the events of the day. His face grew redder as he remembered every little thing that he had said and done. He stood, then he sat, then he stood again. Sighing, he threw up one of his hands as if gesturing in an argument. There was nothing to say, and no one to say it to, but he was still trying to come up with the perfect response that would have made him into a Cascadian knight. He was thankful, at least, that his father was gone for a few hours to attend to some matter of business. This would give Jack time to sulk. He stumbled into his bedroom and threw himself face first into the pillow. A low moaning sound escaped his lips. Goat cheese. Goddamn goat cheese. He remembered how the bureaucrat had simply rolled his eyes and gestured toward the door. Jack rolled over in the bed. His eyes opened wide and stared intensely at the ceiling. He didn't think that it could have gone worse than it did when he was 16, but he supposed that it very well might have. Gritting his teeth, he resolved not to let it bring him down. It's fine, he told himself. He'd have enough money for a sword and some armor soon, and then he'd be able to spend a whole year practicing with them. He'd pick up some more magic, too, and he'd show them these new powers. Then they would have to take him seriously. The third time, as they say, would be the charm. He clenched his fists, staring at the ceiling of his father's ranch house. I'm going to be a hero.